August 15, 1971, a Sunday night. Most of the country is watching Bonanza. Then the picture cuts out. Richard Nixon appears behind a desk, and in the next 17 minutes, without asking Congress, without warning a single foreign government, without consulting the men who ran the global financial system he was about to detonate, he ends it. The dollar's tie to gold, the anchor of the entire post-war economic order, is severed live on national television on a Sunday night, so quietly that most Americans didn't understand what had just happened until Monday morning, when it was already too late to stop it. That's the moment everybody points to. That's the story you've probably heard. Nixon killed the gold standard, and somehow, through some murky deal with the Saudis a few years later, the dollar became the currency the entire planet runs on. Here's the problem. Almost every part of that popular version is either incomplete or flat wrong. There was no single deal that made the dollar the world's currency. There was no signed contract forcing Saudi Arabia to sell oil exclusively in dollars. The document people cite as the petrodollar agreement doesn't say what they think it says, and I'll show you exactly what it does say because I tracked it down. The real story is stranger, slower, and far more revealing about how power actually works than the version that gets repeated in every finance YouTube video and every doom and gloom Twitter thread. So let's go back, not to 1971, further than that, because to understand what the dollar actually is, you have to understand what almost broke it decades before Nixon ever sat down at that desk. July 1944. World War II isn't even over yet. American and British forces have just landed at Normandy weeks earlier, and the outcome in Europe is still genuinely uncertain. And yet, 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations are sitting in the Mount Washington Hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire, working out what money itself is going to mean once the shooting finally stops. This is the Bretton Woods Conference, and it is where the modern dollar is actually born. Not in 1971, not in 1974, but here, in a hotel ballroom in the middle of a war. Two men dominate the negotiations. John Maynard Keynes, representing a British empire that is financially exhausted and militarily depleted, proposes something radical, a brand new neutral global currency called the banker, which no single nation would control. It's an elegant idea. It goes nowhere. Because sitting across from Keynes is an American Treasury official named Harry Dexter White, and White knows something Keynes can't argue around. The United States is holding roughly 2/3 of the entire world's monetary gold. When you hold that much of the actual asset everyone still trusts, you don't need a clever compromise currency. You get to make the rules. The system that emerges is what's called a gold exchange standard. The US dollar gets pegged to gold at exactly $35 an ounce. Every other participating currency gets pegged to the dollar, fixed but adjustable within a tight band. In effect, the dollar becomes as good as gold for the rest of the world, while the US is the only country still directly promising to redeem its currency for the metal itself. This is what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing would later, famously and bitterly, call America's exorbitant privilege. Because what Bretton Woods actually created was a system where the United States could, in effect, print the money the entire world needed for trade and reserves. And as long as everyone believed the dollar was truly convertible to gold, the whole thing held together. It's worth pausing here on something historians rarely emphasize enough. This system worked, spectacularly, for the better part of 2 decades. It gave the war-shattered world fixed exchange rates, predictable trade, and functioning reconstruction financing through the new International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both born at that same conference. It underwrote the fastest sustained period of global growth the industrialized world had ever seen. But it was also, from the very moment of its creation, built around a contradiction nobody in that hotel wanted to look at directly. In 1960, a Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin sat down in front of the United States Congress and explained, calmly and devastatingly, why the system built at Bretton Woods was going to destroy itself. His argument became known as the Triffin dilemma, and it goes like this. For the global economy to function under Bretton Woods, the rest of the world needs a growing supply of dollars to hold as reserves and to conduct trade. The only way the United States can supply that growing pool of dollars is by running persistent balance of payments deficits, sending more dollars out into the world than it takes back in. But here's the trap. The more dollars pile up in foreign central banks, the more those governments start asking an uncomfortable question. Does the United States actually have enough gold sitting in Fort Knox to redeem all of this if we ever demanded it? Every dollar issued to fuel global trade is simultaneously a dollar eroding confidence in the promise behind it. The system needs deficits to survive, and the deficits are what eventually kill it. Through the 1960s, that contradiction stopped being theoretical. Vietnam War spending, the build-out of the Great Society programs, and the cost of maintaining American military commitments across the globe pushed a flood of dollars into foreign hands. Between 1960 and 1971, foreign claims on U.S. gold grew dramatically faster than the actual gold reserves backing them. France, under Charles de Gaulle, began openly and deliberately demanding gold in exchange for its dollar holdings, a direct challenge to Washington, and a signal to everyone else watching that the emperor might not have any clothes. By 1971, U.S. gold reserves had fallen from over 20,000 tons in the years after World War II to roughly 8,000 tons. The math had stopped working. Nixon was left with a choice that had no good option inside it: raise interest rates hard enough to defend the dollar's gold peg, which risked tipping the economy into recession in an election year, or break the promise outright. He broke the promise. 2 days before that Sunday broadcast, Nixon gathered his top economic advisors at Camp David in near-total secrecy. No press, no leaks, barely any staff. Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and a young economist named Paul Volcker, who would go on to reshape American monetary policy a decade later, hammered out what Nixon would call his new economic policy. On August 15, 1971, Nixon announced 3 things at once: a 90-day freeze on wages and prices, a 10% surcharge on imports, and the part that actually mattered for the next 50 years, the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. Foreign governments could no longer walk up to the United States Treasury and trade their dollars for gold at $35 an ounce. The gold window, as it was called, was closed. It was framed as temporary. It was not temporary. The reaction was immediate and global. Japan, blindsided, called it the Nixon Shaku. The Nixon shock, a phrase that stuck in economic history books on both sides of the Pacific. A brief attempt to patch the old system back together, known as the Smithsonian Agreement, collapsed within about a year. By 1973, the major currencies of the world were floating freely against each other for the first time since before the war, their values no longer fixed to gold or to anything at all, except what markets were willing to say they were worth. This is usually where the popular story stops. Nixon ends gold convertibility, the dollar becomes a fiat currency backed by nothing, and cut to a few years later, some secret handshake with the Saudis somehow rescues it and makes it the world's oil currency forever. That gap in the middle is where almost every viral explainer on this topic gets it wrong. So let's go into that gap properly, because it's the most misunderstood chapter in this entire story. Here is what actually happened, and I want to be precise about it, because the popular version has calcified into something close to internet mythology. In October 1973, in the middle of the Yom Kippur War, OPEC's Arab members, led by Saudi Arabia, imposed an oil embargo on the United States and other nations supporting Israel. Oil prices roughly quadrupled within months. Gas lines wrapped around city blocks across America. It was, for millions of ordinary people, the first time the abstraction of geopolitics reached directly into their daily lives in the form of a sign reading, "No gas," outside a station they'd been filling up at for years. Out of that crisis, on June 8, 1974, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Saudi Crown Prince Fahd signed something called the United States, Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation. This is the document that gets cited constantly online as the petrodollar agreement, the supposed contract that locked in dollar-only oil pricing for 50 years. It isn't that. Read the actual joint statement, and it's a framework for expanding economic, technical, and industrial cooperation between the two countries. It says nothing about currency. It says nothing about oil pricing. In fact, and this is the detail almost nobody includes, Saudi Arabia continued accepting British pounds sterling for a portion of its oil sales even after this agreement was signed. There was no clause anywhere requiring exclusive dollar transactions. What actually happened, and this part genuinely was kept secret for over 4 decades, was a separate, quieter arrangement reached later that same year. The United States committed to provide Saudi Arabia with military equipment and security cooperation. In return, Saudi Arabia agreed to funnel a large share of its oil export revenue into purchases of U.S. Treasury securities, financing American government debt. This deal wasn't declassified until 2016, when Bloomberg News obtained the underlying cables through a Freedom of Information Act request to the National Archives. Even economists who have spent careers studying this period, like Gregory Brew at the Eurasia Group, describe the outcome not as some engineered master plan by a cabal of diplomats, but as something that grew organically out of mutual self-interest. The Saudis needed a safe, liquid place to park an enormous windfall of new oil money, and U.S. Treasury debt was the deepest, most trusted market on earth to put it. So here's the corrected picture. There was no single contract that forced global oil into dollars forever. What happened instead was a convergence. Saudi Arabia, the world's swing producer, kept pricing its oil in dollars mostly because that's what it had always done, and because the dollar remained the world's dominant trade and reserve currency anyway, even after Nixon severed it from gold. Other OPEC members followed Saudi Arabia's lead because it was the path of least resistance in a market they didn't want to fragment. And the U.S. government, separately, secured a real, if narrower, financial and military arrangement with Riyadh that helped recycle petrodollars back into American debt markets, propping up the very currency that had just lost its gold anchor. The myth of a single 1974 signature that manufactured the entire modern dollar system is comforting because it gives you a villain, a room, and a date. The truth is less cinematic and more important. The dollar's dominance after 1971 wasn't secured by one deal. It was secured by the absence of any credible alternative, by the sheer depth of American financial markets, by military and diplomatic relationships built over years, and by the simple fact that habits, once established at a global scale, are brutally hard to dislodge, even after the original reason for them disappears. If the truth is more complicated, why does the secret deal version keep spreading? Because it's simpler to share, it fits neatly into 30 seconds of outrage. And this part matters, it plugs directly into a genuine, ongoing anxiety about where the dollar's dominance is actually headed. That anxiety isn't baseless. It's just aimed at the wrong culprit. In June 2024, a wave of social media claims announced that the 50-year petrodollar pact had officially expired and that Saudi Arabia had refused to renew it, sending search interest in the term petrodollar to its highest level ever recorded. Mainstream financial reporters and economists, including UBS's own chief economist, quickly pointed out there was no 50-year contract to expire in the first place, because no such contract existed. What is real and worth watching is something slower and less dramatic. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has been sliding for years, from around 71% in 1999 to somewhere in the high 50% range today, as countries like China work to build alternative payment systems and trade arrangements outside the dollar. That's the actual story of the dollar in this decade. Not a single secret handshake in a Riyadh palace, but a slow, uneven, and still unresolved contest over whether the system built at that New Hampshire hotel in 1944, patched, broken, and rebuilt again in 1971 and 1974, can keep holding up a world that increasingly has other options. And that's what should actually keep you up at night about this topic. Not a conspiracy, a question. The dollar has survived every one of these ruptures so far: the end of gold, the oil shocks, the 2008 crisis, not because of some hidden contract guaranteeing its position, but because every time the rest of the world looked at the alternatives and decided the dollar, cracked as it was still the least risky place to put their trust. That's not a law of physics. It's a habit built on confidence. And historically, when confidence in a currency erodes, it rarely happens all at once. It happens exactly like Triffin predicted back in 1960, slowly, then all at once. So the next time you see a slide claiming some secret 1974 signature single-handedly created the world you're living in financially, you'll know the real story. It's not one deal. It's 50 years of decisions, defaults, wars, and quiet diplomatic cables, stacked on top of a promise made in a hotel ballroom in 1944 that the United States eventually couldn't keep, and got away with breaking anyway, because it turned out the rest of the world didn't have anywhere else to put its trust. If you want to know where I'm typing this from, I'm curious how far this reaches. Drop the state you're watching from in the comments. I read every one of them, and I want to see how many corners of the country this actually lands in. And if this changed how you think about where your dollar actually comes from, there's a subscribe button right there. I'm not going to pretend I don't want you to use it. I do, because it's what lets me keep digging into stories like this one instead of chasing whatever's trending that week. But that's your call, not a favor you owe me. I'll see you in the next one.